Right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to What, Where, Who, an introduction to ICPs. I'm Greg Jarvis, and I'm the ICP Sales Manager at Electrical Testing. So I'm flying solo this morning. It's just me. I don't have any helpers. I'm in charge of all the technology, so hopefully we can make this smooth and make it work. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is just raise your hands if you can hear me. That way that I can be sure. Great. So you're all doing that, which is fantastic. So you can hear, and we can then, without any further ado, move on. So this presentation is about ICPs. I joined electrical testing 8 years ago now to start our ICP business and help get it off the ground. And it's been quite a journey. There are a number of roles that people fulfill here, you know, engineers, officers of different categories. And I'm just the sales guy, but I've learned a lot as we go. So I thought I would give you a sort of fairly sort of potted, interesting history on ICPs. The interesting thing about the connections, I'm just going to get rid of this thing here. Everyone can still hear me, can't they? Because I've got a note that's telling me that they can't. So could you just raise your hands again if you can hear me? Yep, right, great. I don't know why that's saying that, so we'll continue. Acronyms. Acronyms, there are so many acronyms, and maybe that's a lot to do with our industry, but certainly in the connections world, there are a lot of acronyms. And I've just created a brief list, and there are more that I haven't even put on here, but you'll be familiar with a number of these. But every once in a while I come across somebody when I'm using language and I talk about the DNO, and they don't say anything for quite a while. And of course, these things are obvious. You only know about them once you know what they are. So DNO, distribution network operator. People don't always know that. People aren't familiar with what an IDNO is, which is an independent distribution network operator. NERS is National Electricity Registration Scheme. And there's a few others on there that you can see. Ofgem, fairly important office for gas and electricity markets. And provider, NERS provider. So what is an ICP? Well, an ICP is an independent connections provider. And basically in around 2000, the introduction of competition connections by Ofgem, an electricity market fell some way behind the gas market. They were already up and running with competition. So that came about in around 2000. And the idea of it was to reduce the monopolies of the DNO. Basically, they were the only people who could work on their own networks. And the connections market is worth over £500 million a year. And there are thousands upon thousands of connections being done all the time. So as far as the DNOs are concerned, there are 6 main DNOs in the UK as we currently stand. And I'll start at the top of the country. You've got Scottish and Southern Energy, SSE. They also are in Scotland, northern Scotland, and on the south coast, sort of roughly in the middle of the country. You can see at the bottom of the map there. And then you've got SPEN, which is Scottish and Southern Energy. And they have 2 sections. They have SPEN, which is sort of in that lower band of Scotland. And they also have an area which is above North Wales, eking into England, and that's called their ManWeb area. And ManWeb, interestingly, stands for Manchester and Wales Electricity Board. That's what it used to be called. To the right, you've then got Northern Power Grid on down the east coast, which goes all the way down from Scottish Power Region down to into Lincolnshire, and then to the left, Electricity Northwest. Below that, across the huge swathe of the UK, from the east coast to the west coast, covering the southwest and Wales, you've got Western Power Distribution, which we actually refer to as WPD, and I've got WPG there, so apologies for that. And then down in the southeast, we have UK Power Networks. Their region is split into 3. They've got Eastern Power Networks, Southern Power Networks, and London Power Networks. That London area, obviously capital city, and although it isn't exactly on the map, you can think of it as a sort of greater London, inner London area. There are also what are called IDNOs. I mentioned that earlier on, independent distribution network operators. There are over 13 of them in the UK, we work with GTC, Energetics and ESP, and certainly GTC and Energetics are two of the largest. And they are responsible, this is a stat that I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but somewhere in the region of 60 to 70% of new developments are IDNO networks. So that means that the DNO network will come to a certain point, and then from there it will become an IDNO network. And they'll put in the gas, they'll put in the electricity, and they'll put in the water. And in some cases, they'll actually be responsible for charging the clients, for the residents for their energy, or for their water, or for their gas. So they will sort of be all-encompassing in that regard. So that's GTC, Energetics, IDNOs. Which brings me on to Lloyds and NERS. NERS, National Electricity Registration Scheme. Now, basically the DNOs, so Ofgem have said, look, you need to do more for competition, and they got together and they've instructed Lloyds Register to run the NERS scheme. And a company can apply to become an ICP, service provider, and Lloyds will come out and do a technical assessment of the service provider, and they'll do this twice a year. They'll do a desktop audit and they'll do an on-site audit. And this picture on the left here is actually my first ever audit with Lloyds, who came out to see us doing a service transfer on a street light. Now, obviously, with ICPs, you can have both LV and HV, and it covers both unmetered and metered works. So who can become an ICP? Well, anybody who wants to become a provider of contestable services could become an ICP. There's an application form you fill out, you send it to Lloyds with a cheque for between £5,000 and £15,000, and that depends on the scope of activity that you require. So there is partial accreditation as part of that assessment, and then there's moving on to full accreditation. When you have partial accreditation, that basically means that Lloyds have approved the work that you're doing, in the sense that your processes and your staffing and everything is correct, and they're happy that from at this point onwards, you can now go and bid for work. And then once you bid for work, you call Lloyds back and you say, right, we've got some work. Can you come along with a view to auditing us to get full accreditation? And then basically they'll go through the whole process, which is what that chap was doing in the previous picture. And then you get in your full accreditation, and then you're off and running. There are four main categories. There's project management, design, construction, and second-tier civils. And actually, it's worth making the distinction between these. So as an ICP, you could just be a project manager. So you don't have any staff, there are no craftsmen who actually deliver work on site. You are simply having the skills necessary to manage an ICP, basically a subcontractor, who also must be NERS accredited and be an ICP in their own right, and importantly, have the construction element. There's ICPs who purely do design. Again, no staff, no craftsmen. They literally will receive designs. So somebody wants a substation, somebody wants mains extension, somebody wants whatever it is. EV charging points, for example, are fairly relevant with regard to designs. Lots of design work needed to be done in order to approve a connection. That connection design will still need to go to the DNO themselves to be approved. So there's the designers, there's the construction type, which is for those who are doing all aspects of the work. And then there is a group called second tier civils. And that is for civils contractors who basically they're not allowed to ever tender for works directly. They can only ever work for a company who has basically project management or construction. And they can come along and there are clear boundaries, clear works that they can do and works that they can't do. And that's basically second tier civils. And very much if you are looking for design, project management, second tier civils only as a scope, then those costs are likely to be much lower to NERS, to Lloyds, than if you were going to go for construction, which is everything. So that's your £15,000 check. And if you were perhaps, design or second tier civils, you may be somewhere closer to 5, 8 grand. So under construction, which we'll talk about, there are different scopes of registration, and you don't get all of these in one go. These are different levels and you apply for as you go, but there's obviously the design, project management, cable laying, different categories, 11 kV, LV, 11 kV, 33 and 132, cable jointing, overhead lines, substation installation, associated civils, network switching, and cable identification. So you would have to get Lloyds in each time you wanted to move or apply for any one of those scopes. So you could have one or multiple, and they would need to come back and authorize you. And you would go through the same process of having partial to start with up to full accreditation. Scope of works, I'm going to focus mainly on unmetered stuff here because effectively that's what we do as an ICP, and that's what I'm sort of authorized, as it were, to talk about. But on the unmetered connections, this is applicable to works and underground cables and overhead lines, unmetered, single phase, 230 volt points of supply with loads of 25 amps or less. So that's things like your transfer, permanent disconnections, reconnections, and service extensions. And new services, of course, as well, where we're jointing onto the main. On the unmetered side, typical types of loads for street lighting, illuminated bollards, traffic signal controllers, advertising hoardings, bus shelters, kiosks, broadband, etc. Those are the sorts of activity that we are looking at and have done over my last 8 years. So when you're an ICP, there are certain critical roles that need to be fulfilled within the organization, and Lloyds will look at these and look at the processes. But essentially, there's an assessing officer. The assessing officer is the only one that doesn't need to be full-time employed by the ICP. But in order to become a NERS registered ICP in the beginning, you need to have an assessing officer. And this is a person who's appointed by the ICP to assess the competency of individuals nominated for appointment as competent persons. So you know, the jointer, for example, or the QS, and for recommending them for authorization by the authorizing officer. The authorizing officer is the person who's appointed by the provider as responsible for assigning competencies based upon the recommendations of the assessing officer. So they will actually say, yeah, do you know what, here we go, there's a guy who we want to put forward as a jointer, and they will assess their ability to authorize their ability to carry out the work. And then there's the QS, and he's basically a competent person who's appointed by the provider and has specific and direct responsibility for the safety and quality and technical standard of all the work. So on a day-to-day basis, he is the guy who is putting the guys to work every day, making sure, auditing, making sure that, you know, the PPE is being worn, that they're performing their roles properly, looking at the administration element, making sure work is being submitted to the DNO properly, all the criteria that's involved in running an ICP, you know, is falling under him. So the authorizing officer will issue a NERS passport, and this is issued to an individual, to a craftsman. That book, the guy keeps with him all the time. It has his inductions in it. It has his training and competencies, as well as the competency reviews. So they'll be reviewed periodically, audit and employment history, and they must all have a valid NERS passport, and that's for any activity. So civil, whether it doesn't matter whether you're a civils guy, a support person, a jointer's mate, or a jointer, you must all have a valid NERS passport. So the next question is, where can I find an ICP? Well, it's fair to say that through lack of knowledge, habit, or experience, lots of customers opt for a DNO, the DNO, when carrying out connections work. And it may be that street lighting people know about ICPs, but I hear from lots of different divisions within local authorities, traffic signals, for example, or people who do traffic schemes like VRS barriers, that sort of work, and they need to have columns moved. They are still today using the DNO and weren't even necessarily aware that ICPs existed. So where could you find an ICP? Well, you could go to the Lloyds NERS website. They've got an excellent website where you can basically search for an ICP. There are over 294 ICPs in the UK, and they have on their website a really good search function where you can search by the DNO, by the region, by the scope of works. So you can be very specific about what you're after. And then when you do that, you would then find a list of ICPs. You'd be left with a list of ICPs who can carry out the work that you're interested in. The question is that fair? Is that an equal playing field from the DNO and ICP perspective? I mean, surely if the DNO are the first port of call, then they're the ones who are going to get all the work, unless you are in the know. Well, I'm very pleased to tell you that whether it's Ofgem who've had that impact on them saying, look, you need to be doing more, or whether they've done it of their own free will, I can tell you that they all have specific pages that facilitate competition in connections. And they do actively promote to their customers when doing quotes, for example, that they have a choice. So I've seen plenty of UKPN quotes. Here's our quote for doing the work, but you do have a choice. You can use an ICP, and they will direct people in the direction of the likes of us who can carry out the work. They have links on their website to ICPs that work in their DNO footprint. So I've just chosen a few here. We work in 5 of the 6 DNOs. So I've left out Northern Power Grid, but here's some examples: Western Power Distribution, UK Power Networks, Scottish and Southern, and SPEN, SP Energy Networks. Very, very easy to find on their websites. ICP activity, didn't take me very long to find these pages at all. And there's lots of information. They all do it slightly differently, but the information is very clear and valid. And they're very happy to point people in our direction. So what about quality though? Is it like your car? I remember in the old days, you used to, if you had a big BMW, a nice BMW car, that you had to take it to a BMW dealer because they were going to use the proper parts, give it the proper service, and you were maybe a bit suspicious about taking it perhaps to your local independent garage because they might not use the same quality of service, same quality parts, etc. Well, Lloyds have said that all the work must be done to no less a standard than the DNO themselves. And I think it's fair to say that in the early days when the DNOs could come out and audit you at will, unannounced, it really kept ICPs honest. The quality of the work had to be right. So if you were a craftsman and you're out there working and you haven't got all your tools with you, or you haven't got your fire extinguisher, or your signing and guarding's not right, or you're not braiding the cable to the right amount, all these things would be picked up on very, very quickly, and the guy could stop you working, and that's not doing you or your company's reputation any good. So I would argue that the quality of staff on site is extremely high. But in the beginning, in the early days, in order for you to be assessed and be given a NERS passport, you had to, well, you had a NERS passport, but you had to have a ticket, i.e. a jointing ticket. And you would have to go and do a trade test. So the provider would select a craftsman, say, right, and he would have done his training. And when they feel he's ready to do his training, he would go and do the trade test. And he would do this craft assessment. I've never done it. Very, very nerve-wracking thing. You're doing it in the DNO jointing school, and it's a very simple pass or fail. And if you fail, it's not simply booking it again and going to do it again. You've got to wait at least 3 months before you can do it again. Or the ICP decide, actually, you know what, he passed it so badly, he's not up to it. So they wouldn't do it at all. A couple more acronyms here: CIC and COP, which is Competition and Connections and Code of Practice. In 2017, there was an update to the Code of Practice, which basically introduced a few options. And there were 4, but for our benefit, we'll just focus on 1 and 2. And option 1 is self-authorization of staff. And option 2 is assessment by the DNO training school. And basically, you could go to the DNO and say, under the new COP, we would like to go option 1, which basically means we are going to assess our own joining staff and tell you whether they're competent or not, and we're able to put them to site without needing to have any DNO interaction. The DNO wouldn't have to agree to that. They could say, no, we're not happy with that. We don't feel that you guys are up to it, of assessing, that is. And I'm not saying they've always done that. Certainly can only speak from our own experience, but we would be given option 1 on all the DNOs we work on, which is Scottish Power, WPD, UK Power Networks and SSE. And so we assess and authorise our own staff and put them to site. But there are some who might be new to jointing, and perhaps their staff don't have as much experience, and they'll still choose to go option 2 and have the DNO assess them. So how do I appoint an ICP? How do you get the ICP to work? You've got work for them. How does the process go? Well, basically agreements, and we're going to focus again on unmetered connections work. So the ICP will have a network access agreement and an adoption agreement. And the network access agreement basically is the DNO giving them access to their network, saying that they can work there, and that's an integral part of the agreement with the DNO. And then there's the adoption agreement. And the adoption agreement effectively says that the DNO will adopt the work of the ICP. So everything from the cutout down to the service cable and to the joint onto their DNO network. Believe it's 2 years that we have to make a joint last for, and I understand you've got to make a pretty big balls up in order to not make a decent joint that lasts for 2 years, and after that the DNO assume all responsibility for it. Within that 2 years, however, if there's a fault or your joint goes down for whatever reason and the light goes out, you as the ICP do not get a chance to go back and fix it. What then happens is the DNO will go out, they will investigate it, they'll dig down, they'll cut out the joint, they'll put a new joint back in and put your asset back in power. And then you're basically left with a scenario whereby they'll then send you a bill for going out to fix your fault. And obviously if there's major issues with what you've done, that could have serious ramifications as well. So you'll have those agreements. They're all slightly different in terms of the process. So once you're set up and you've agreed with the DNO that you as an ICP can work on the network, they're all slightly different with working with different customers. So UK Power Networks, they require a contract between the local authority and UKPN themselves, which is called an Asset Owners Agreement. And the Asset Owners Agreement basically just facilitates, it's a gateway for the local authority to use an ICP in the first place. Within that Asset Owners Agreement, there's an Appendix 3 letter at the back. So once that agreement has been signed by both parties, the local authority will then fill out the Appendix 3 letter at the back, naming the ICP that they would like to use. And you can have multiple ICPs working for you as a local authority. You're not just tied down to one. So the Asset Agreement is the gateway, and the Appendix 3 letter, it allows you to nominate as many ICPs as you like. Timescales for work, basically, the agreements take about 3 weeks. They used to take longer, significantly longer, but UKPN have done a fantastic job at turning that around. So now it's about 3 weeks to get the agreements in place. We then need to send weekly programs of work sent prior and after. That's called whereabouts, beenabouts. New services take a week for approval. So you send me a new connection. I maybe have a week of processing that. I send that off to UKPN. They've got a week to turn that around and come back to me. It used to be 2 weeks. They're now much quicker. So there's now sort of a week for it to come back. And then we can then put a date in the diary to go and do that job. Transfers and disconnections. If you've got a good history with UKPN and you've proven yourself to be diligent with everything you're doing, it doesn't apply to everybody. So a brand new ICP wouldn't have this in the beginning, but they can earn this right, if you like. You have a scenario whereby disconnections and transfers can be done with 48 hours notice. And I've always thought that was a fairly unique selling point, is that if you're working with a local authority and they have a knockdown, you could effectively turn that round within a week. So if you've got knockdown on Monday, they could tell you about it. Well, they would need to call the DNO first to do a emergency disconnection. So an RTA, we can't do faults, but they could get the UKPN to do that, but they could let us know on the Monday, on the day it was knocked down. We've then got 48 hours, which basically means by sort of Thursday, there's no reason why we couldn't have a new column in the ground and in light, which is I think is a hell of a turnaround. So yeah, there you go. Transfers and disconnections, 48 hours notice. WPD, there are no further agreements with WPD. So there's nothing between Western Power and the local authority. You can literally say, right, here's an ICP. I'd like to go and do this work, because we already, as an ICP, have the network access and adoption agreements in place. That applies for all the DNOs. So the work also doesn't require approval from WPD. You literally provide me the work on a spreadsheet for all intents and purposes. I need to send that to them on a Monday. This is where it does get tricky. I need to send that to them on a Monday. That's the whereabouts. And I cannot start work on that program of works until the following Monday. And I can only do the work that week that I sent over on that Monday. I can't suddenly get to Friday of that first week and go, oh, actually, we've got to change. Only the work that you were sent over. And then on the third Monday, i.e. the Monday after the work has been done, you send them the beanabouts. And there is no flexibility in the program. Now, that's not to say that if there was an emergency, they couldn't grant you permission to do something. But those need to be the exception rather than the rule, because many times when somebody's changed their mind or something's gone wrong and you want to do something else, it's been a no. So it's really about your processes and getting those correct in order to not have any mess ups and be able to be productive and carry out the work that you've sent over initially, which isn't always easy because sometimes things do change on site, but those are their rules. SSE, you have a letter of appointment from the ICP. So all that has to happen is you're the local authority and there is a sort of template letter, and you would send that off to SSE saying, we would like to engage, or we have engaged with electrical testing to carry out some connections work for us in this region, this area, this town, whatever it may be. They could be quite specific or quite general, depending on the work that's required. Again, the work does not require approval by SSE. They have 10 days whereabouts prior to start, and we have to send daily whereabouts as well. And again, on the following Monday, we have to send the beanabouts. So, but they're very, very hot on the daily whereabouts. They want to know where you are every day and what you're doing. And those daily whereabouts need to be the same as what the 10-day whereabouts were when you sent them in. SPEN, as another example, they have a bit more of a complex scenario. They do everything they do through a website, a web portal called Radar. And you, as the local authority and the ICP and SPEN, enter into what's called a tripartite agreement. This process can take quite a long time. I would sometimes quote customers 6 to 8 weeks just to get that agreement signed by all parties and get us to a position where we are then able to submit works through this web portal. You submit the works, that then gets approved. The timescale is about 8 weeks, like I said, to get that whole process turned around. You send whereabouts in, roughly they would like a couple of weeks whereabouts, so probably you can add 2 weeks on top of that 8 weeks. And then the beanabouts need to be returned the following week as well. They're a lot more flexible in terms of the programming. You can update them with changes in the program. But 10 weeks to site from talking to somebody to actually getting them on board is quite a long time. Right, I'm conscious I'm getting through my 30 minutes. DNOs versus ICP. So the pros and the cons. So why would you choose one over the other? Well, I'll start with the DNO. The DNO, let's talk about the pros. They have multiple depots all over the place, which basically allows them access, easy access to the work that they want, you want them to carry out. And they'll carry out any quantity of work. So, you know, if you want them to carry out one transfer or one disconnection or one new service, that's not a problem because there's a local depot and that guy can come out and do that. And he'll do that for their schedule of rate price on unmetered work. They own the network and they can carry activity that others can't. So sometimes we've had, more recently, there was a job we were being asked to connect to, and we were under the impression there was an LV main there, but it doesn't show on the drawings. And as a result, and it might not show for a number of reasons, but it doesn't show on the drawings. And so therefore we're not allowed to connect to it. But there's nothing to say that the DNO won't connect to it themselves. But it's their network, and there are certain things that they can do, certain activity they can do. They can carry out non-contestable works. So works are situated in contestable and non-contestable. And it may be that as part of a project, there is an element of both, and it would be just simply easier to use the DNO to do all the work rather than sort of having two different orders and splitting it and needing to manage two different contractors effectively doing the work. The cons, well, all jobs require quotes from the DNO, and that can take a long time. They've got long lead-ins to site. Quotes can take 5, 6 weeks. I'm sure they would argue that, you know, some can be done much quicker, but my experience and certainly customers tell me that it takes ages for them to quote. And then obviously they've got long lead-ins to get to site. Events can take away resources from your works. So certainly in some parts of the country, if we've had bad extreme weather, for example, they could be working on your works, and then suddenly your works will take a backseat to the precedent of putting people back on power, which is sort of understandable, but that doesn't help you if you've got works and you've got timescales that you need this work completed in, because a lot of the time you've got other contractors who are doing other bits and you need them there in order to keep everything flowing. So that can be frustrating. They don't offer non-DNO services, and by that I mean things like column work and lantern work. So certainly, you know, ourselves as an ICP, we offer a turnkey service, so we can put columns in the ground, we can take them out, we can put lanterns on, we can put feeder pillars in the ground, all those additional services that the DNO won't do because they just do the DNO bit. And then lastly, a lack of innovation at customer level. I think, and I'm told they're sort of quite backward perhaps in the way that they do things, not necessarily backward, but they do things the way they've always done them. Certainly when it comes to ICPs, hopefully you're looking at perhaps more innovation. So pros and cons of the DNOs, the ICP. So let's look at the cons, look at the negatives. We're not the DNO, and there are certain things that we can't do, things like faults, road traffic accidents. We can't do those sorts of things. And small volume works. We don't have local depots. So, you know, if I'm over in Norfolk and I'm not working, for example, and I'm not working there, so I can say it, but let's just say Shropshire. But I've got a relationship with Shropshire and they say, oh, I've got this one transfer, it's really urgent. It's so difficult for me to mobilize to go and do one unit, and certainly to do it at a cost which would make sense to you, because the DNO will probably be a lot cheaper because their depot is just around the corner. So that makes it very, very difficult. We're restricted by the DNO timescales and regulations. So if you are a brand new customer to me or any ICP, there is going to be a significant lead-in to get to site, whether it's through the agreements, whether it's through the timescales that the DNO impose on us. So there's always an issue. It doesn't always have such a dramatic effect, and certainly if we're already set up with the DNO and we're already set up with you as a customer, then some things can be turned around quite quickly. But SSE, for example, you have to start the process all over again every time it's a new batch of works, which is very frustrating. As I said before, we're unable to be cost effective on small volumes of work. You know, the DNO can do that one connection for a cheaper price than I can, because I need to charge you much more, a day rate effectively, to make it work. So the pros, same quality, but better price. I would argue, I've seen DNO rates and I've seen our rates and ICP rates, and a lot of the time there's a significant saving to be made, especially when you're talking about quantity of work. We don't automatically assume that we're going to win work. So we have to put a really positive focus on customer service, communication and delivery times. Again, delivery times within the confines of the DNO regulations, but certainly communicating with customers and providing a good service is really important and helps us to win work moving forward. Innovation, I mentioned that before with the DNO, but you know, our guys are using tablets. We've got web portals with pictures and reports that show you instantly exactly what's happening all the time. There's no place to hide in terms of the quality. You can look at the quality of the reinstatements on the ground at the same time as we finish them. It's that sort of innovation, and that will improve moving forward, that, you know, would separate us from the DNO in that respect. And other services such as column and lantern work, which I talked about, you know, doing all those other things. Otherwise, you as a customer, you've got to manage a different contractor for different elements of it. So, you know, you're managing a contractor for digging a hole, you're managing a contractor for doing jointing, you're managing another contractor who's doing the column work and the lantern work. And if you can just give that to one person to deal with and do everything, it makes your life so much easier. So there's the pros and cons. Who's the winner? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there is no winner, because I don't think we're actually in competition any longer. I think ICPs and DNOs, I think we offer a different service to different customers at different times. And as a result, I think there's room for both of us. Certainly on my level, on the unmetered connection side, I'm sure there are plenty of DNOs and different staff in the DNOs that would like to be doing so many service transfers on street lighting columns, for example. But they've got more than enough work to keep them busy in other areas. And therefore, I think there's room for both of us. So that about wraps it up. Were there any questions? I think there may have been some questions. There is a little question tab for you. I'll have a look and see. So I do have a question here. Once you're accredited, does this have a time limit, i.e. do you need to keep paying Lloyds? That's a good question. Do I know the answer to that? I think you pay your, yes, you do. I think there is a yearly fee to Lloyds. Yes, there is. Certainly every time you come along and you do they do their audits, you'll be paying for those, certainly. I'm not one to speak ill of Lloyds, because we all sit on a panel. ICPs have a choice to sit on the panel and be active. The issue I have is that when it comes to audits, they're announced. And in the old days, I said earlier, the DNOs would come out and keep you very honest because you never knew when they were coming out. I certainly remember a UKPN auditor who came out and everyone's head would drop because he was so thorough and so specific. But you know, that was a good thing. Lloyds would argue they do the same thing, but what they do is they say, oh yeah, can we come and see you? And you know, when's good for you? Right, yeah, 3 weeks time on a Wednesday. Where are you going to be? Oh, we'll be in this road doing this job. Brilliant, great, we'll see you there. And then as the ICP, you've got 3 weeks to make sure that everything is absolutely tickety-boo before they turn up. And I sort of feel that that is, you know, it enables people who perhaps aren't as well organised as they should be to get away with a lot more. Somebody's asked, can we see this again? Can we see what again? Certainly, if you mean the presentation, then yes, the presentation is on our website, or will be on our website in the next few days, on our webinar page, where you can actually see any of our previous webinars. So log on there and you can look at all of the ones that we've done. We do intend to do more in the future. They take a lot of work, a lot of time, and everybody's very busy, and certainly as sort of lockdown has sort of finished and life is trying to get back to normal, people are going to be much busier. And so we're probably not going to do them quite as often. So perhaps every couple of months we're going to do one. So if you've got any topics, then please email us and let us know things that you'd like to hear about. We're thinking about doing one on earthing, specifically to EV earthing as well. So if there's any topics you'd like to hear more about, then please let us know. But otherwise, thank you for logging in. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been interesting and you've learned something from it. That's the most important thing. Yeah, stay safe and we'll see you all again soon. Thanks very much.